Well, it's just struck 4, so welcome everybody to this presentation, and I'm absolutely honoured to be asked by...
This meeting is being recorded.
Thank you. I'll say continue. To introduce Karl, our speaker for today, and I'm just going to I just put down I have many options of how to introduce him, but this is I'm introducing him from this recent book called Accessing Academic Discourse, edited by Maton, and Doran, and I thought that was an appropriate introduction given the topic of his talk. So I'll just say Karl Maton is a professor of sociology at the University of Sydney and director of the LCT Centre for Knowledge Building, honorary professor at Rhodes University, South Africa, and honorary professor at the University of Witwatersrand, that's my pronunciation, South Africa. He's the creator of legitimation code theory, Karl's book Knowledge and Knowers Towards a Realistic Sociology of Education. Is the founding text of LCT, and that was first published by Routledge in 2014. It's been translated into Chinese in 2019, and a primer of how to enact LCT in research called Knowledge Building, Educational Studies in Legitimation Code Theory with Sue Hood and Shay, was published by Routledge in 2016. Karl is currently co-editing a collection on studying science with Maton and Doran and supervising the translation into Spanish of a primer of key LCT texts. So that shows the breadth of Karl's influence, and he's been an amazing community builder in Sydney, and I've been very, very fortunate to learn so much about him in my field of education. So I'm going to introduce Karl with the topic or the title of his talk, The Next Phase of Collaboration with Legitimation Code Theory, Autonomy Tours and Building Knowledge from Diverse Sources. Thank you, Karl.
Thanks, Sally. And so I need to now fiddle for a moment. So I share my screen and hopefully that's working fine. If it isn't, please tell me, somebody. Okay, so first I'd like to thank Sally for that introduction and also thank Vinto for inviting me to do this. And thanks to all of you in the various places you are for joining us here. So today I'm going to discuss some ideas from legitimation code theory, or LCT, that might be useful to systemic functional linguists. SFL and LCT have been involved in a close and productive dialogue for many years, and a growing number of scholars use both theories together to add greater power to their explanations of social practice. The theories also push each other forward. Each framework highlights issues the other framework has not addressed, leading to the development of new ideas. And today I'm going to introduce some concepts from LCT that might help to shape a new phase of this collaboration. And the ideas are called autonomy, and they can help us understand how different kinds of knowledge and practice are brought together. So this talk's going to have 4 main parts. First, I'll briefly outline how SFL and LCT both complement each other and push each other forward. And then secondly, I'll introduce some concepts of autonomy codes. Third, I'll illustrate what those concepts can reveal with some examples from analyses of classrooms, although that's by far not the only thing they can be used for. And then I'll conclude by asking how they might be useful to SFL, how they could support SFL studies of practices like education, and how they can support, do you want to mute yourself, Ian? And how you can support SFL theoretically with issues of things like consistency in register and shifts in field and things like that. So I'll start then by introducing legitimation code theory, LCT. So LCT is a sociological framework, and like SFL, it's a toolkit that's used for empirical research and to shape practice. And so far, LCT has mostly been used to look at knowledge practices, especially in education, but But also there's been a number of uses more widely, such as looking at museums, looking at legal processes, and it's often used alongside SFL. Now, it's well known that from the 1960s, Michael Halliday and Rukai Hassan both enjoyed productive dialogues with Basil Bernstein, and Bernstein's theoretical framework is one of the foundational frameworks for LCT. So from pretty early on, SFL and code theory, which is the sort of the kind of name I kind of use for the sort of longer tradition, sort of taking Bernstein and then SFL, Bernstein and LCT together. So from early on, SFL and code theory were engaged in a sort of dialogue. And it began with Bernstein's concept of, well, revolved around Bernstein's concept of coding orientation and what became known in SFL, christened by Jim Martin as semantic variation. In the 1990s, it focused on issues around pedagogic discourse and genre-based literacy. And around about the turn of the century, it began centering on Bernstein's notion of knowledge structure and the SFL notion of field. Now, at that point of the story, that kind of focus at that moment is discussed at length in the introduction, the first chapter of the book that Sally was mentioning, by Jim Martin, myself, and Jürgen Doran, Accessing Academic Discourse, because that was a moment, a kind of profound moment, really, in which SFL encountered LCT. LCT emerged from the early 2000s, and it changed the nature of this dialogue. I'm going to go through all of this, as you can see on the slide. I'm not going to go through it all, but you can just see from that table that there's several phases over the past 20 years. And you can see that many, many, many more concepts are now becoming involved in this dialogue, in this exchange. In fact, almost everything in both theories is now involved in some way in the exchange. From the perspective of LCT, these phases have been catalyzed by new dimensions. That's the name that we use for groups of concepts that examine a particular set of organizing principles that underlie practice. So, for example, phase 5, you'll see the semantics dimension from the code theory side of things. That was only created in the mid 2000s, mid to late 2000s. So the fact that it's only become part of the dialogue since then as phase 5 is simply because it didn't exist beforehand. And that doesn't mean that specialization, which was key to phase 4, is no longer part of the collaboration. It still is, it's still part of that. So it's really piled up. The amount of things involved have grown. And I mean, part of that is that LCT is a lot younger than SFL. And as it's grown, as new dimensions are created, they can come in and they can sometimes have quite a big impact on the dialogue and collaboration that has been going on for decades. Now, one reason for much that impact has helped shape both theories is that we now work together far more closely than ever before. So before 2005, the main people involved were fewer, for one thing, and they lived at other end, the other side of the world from each other. So when Basil Bernstein was dialoguing about various things with Rukai Hassan, for example, in the 80s, Hassan was in Sydney, Bernstein was in London, they're the other side of the world. And they didn't have Zoom or Skype or anything like that back then. But in 2005, I moved to Australia. And from about 2007, I think it was, I began working very closely with Jim Martin and Sue Hood, and then more and more and more SFL scholars and engaging with that group around Sydney, the Sydney School and so on. And that makes a really big difference. I mean, particularly if you're able to sit down with data and share that data and analyze it together. So instead of discussing ideas abstractly, you're actually bringing the concept to bear on data that the other person can see, real world data. And that becomes a kind of Archimedean point. It becomes a point of leverage, an extra theoretical, a thing outside each of the theory against which the theory is being brought to bear. And that provides a means of being able to see how things what happens is that the other theory will shed light on something your theory just cannot handle, or hasn't seen before, or it doesn't quite fit yet, and that begins to open up all sorts of new possibilities. So the dialogue has become ever more close, and more people are using those both theories in the research to offer sort of complementary analyses. Now, why do SFL scholars do that? Don't you have enough concepts to learn already? You do. You have an enormous number of concepts. It's an extravagant theoretical framework with like just, I don't know, loads of concepts. But sometimes LCT can be useful. So if we take, for example, the LCT idea of semantic waves. Now that's it's from phase 5. It's the most recent phase of collaboration. And I'm just going to do something very simple. This is what's called a semantic profile, or what you do is you trace SG, or semantic gravity. You don't have to do both, but I'm going to do it very briefly in this simple example. Semantic gravity refers to the context dependence of knowledge or practice. And on a profile, it's shown stronger at the bottom to weaker at the top. So from really simple words, from concrete to more abstract, although I hate that word because I don't know what it means half the time, but you know what I mean, from more context dependent to less context dependent. And we also look at semantic density, which refers to the complexity of knowledge, and that's usually shown from simpler to more complex up here on the y-axis. And then we trace changes in that knowledge over time or over text time, whatever it might be. So you can use these things to analyze changes in the forms taken by knowledge through writing, through an essay, an article, a curriculum, an entire book, or a classroom, or whatever it might be. And that's an imaginary one I just drew, which is one kind of semantic wave. A semantic wave is when you move back and forward. They move back and forward you're moving between simpler and more complex knowledge. You're moving between concrete and more abstract knowledge. Now, that's a very simple introduction to that, but studies using those ideas are showing more and more and more that semantic waves of this kind are a key to building knowledge over time, and also what's rewarded in student assignments. They're a key to success in education. Now, I'm going to use these ideas to illustrate very briefly 2 ways that SFL and LCT stimulate each other. Stimulate, Jim says perturb, provoke is another word. Stimulate, I thought sounded more nicer, should we say. So the first is that they're an example of how SFL and LCT can be used together to shed more light on what's being studied. So we can use semantic profiles to explore the changes in the forms taken by knowledge through a text, or whatever that text might be. And we use SFL to reveal the linguistic, or more widely the semiotic resources drawn upon to achieve those changes in the forms taken by knowledge or practice. So for example, if the LCT analysis showed that profile in a text, then SFL analysis might reveal that this move here from simple concrete knowledge, such as maybe, I don't know, an empirical example or a personal experience or something like that, up to more concrete, a little bit more concrete, a bit more abstract, such as a generalization or maybe a theory or something. That might involve, amongst other things, it might involve grammatical metaphor. But the SFL analysis then may show that another upshift, so this is an upshift, a movement upwards, another part of it at another point in the text actually involves different linguistic resources, such as those shown by periodicity. So now that's not the only way that they're used together, but it illustrates how they can shed light on complementary features of practice. In that case, the SFL would show the range of the linguistic resources used to shape changes in knowledge. It shows difference, basically. It shows difference where the LCT analysis might only see similarity. So in this case, this imaginary case I'm giving, we've got 2 upshifts that LCT will just see as an upshift and an upshift. But we can see with the SFL that one is achieved through one set of semiotic resources and another through another. And conversely, LCT can show that these semantic waves, or they can actually show the semantic waves, which is a feature maybe not seen by analyzing all the different linguistic resources at play. And SFL analysis could show an enormous range of features of language that are being used. Language is bloody complex, as you know, and SFL is complex too. And it might be difficult to see the simple point that this text, even in this mentioning example, which is very similar to, I actually think I stole that profile from an actual real world example. We can see the simple point with the LCT that there's a wave going on. So LCT can show similarity where SFL might see only difference. So that's one stimulant that they help each other to see more. Now I mean, that is just a very simplistic example and a bit of an abstract one. But I mean, if you look at people's PhDs, you look at studies, particularly bigger studies, and articles as well, you can see the way in which people are using them together to see complementary aspects of their object of study. And that's one stimulant. And the second one, and that's in studies, for example, and also in practice, shaping practice. A second stimulant is that they push us to ask questions of our own theory, and that leads to theoretical advance. That doesn't happen in the abstract. It's a result of using the theories on the same data to solve real-world problems. And doing that, what I described earlier on, in the course of doing that, one theory might highlight something the other theory doesn't know how to conceptualize. And that might eventually lead to new concepts. So for example, many years of analyzing data, I found that working with SFL scholars, concepts like grammatical metaphor, for example, raised questions for me about how LCT could address changes in the complexity of knowledge. And that eventually helped influence the creation of the concept of semantic density. And then Jim Martin, after working with me for years while I was using semantic density, came to see that maybe complexity had far more linguistic features than just grammatical metaphor, that it involved field, mode, and tenor. And then he eventually catalogued all those features under the overarching sort of meta concept, no, not really, a kind of bigger concept of mass. And if you don't know Jim's concepts of mass and presence, I recommend buying that book, Accessing Academic Discourse, and reading them in there. So the really interesting questions are raised by ourselves. So Jim's asking questions in this example, Jim's asking questions of SFL, I'm asking questions of LCT, but they come in response to each other. And sometimes we ask questions. I remember Jim saying, you know, what is grammatical metaphor, over and over again, like he was the dentist in Marathon Man, which if you haven't seen the film, don't. You'll never go to a dentist again. But usually we're stimulated to ask questions ourselves. So in short, LCT has helped SFL scholars by simplifying in some ways or showing similarity in some ways where difference is only seen. And science, and also showing other issues are more complex perhaps than previously thought. I mean, when SFL identifies a complex collection of linguistic resources, for example, sometimes people use an LCT analysis as a sort of hook, as it were, on which to hang them. They're all parts of a semantic wave, for example, or they're all generated by a knowledge code or by a rhizomatic code or a combination of those two. So LCT can show the organizing principles underlying the bringing together of a very big diverse range of semiotic resources that SFL has shown. And second, when SFL thinks it's got something theorized, seeing it from another perspective can reveal there's more to it than previously thought. And SFL does the same for LCT. Okay, so why have I shown you all this, told you all this? Well, because what I'm going to discuss now might be useful to you, may, I said both words at the same time, I think, may be useful to you on those two lines. First, analyzing autonomy codes might prove a useful complement to SFL analysis. For example, it might help understand what's going on in texts that shift around a lot in terms of their field, mode, and tenor. It might show that while some are chaotic, others are actually successful at what they intend to achieve, so it might help simplify things. And second, it might raise some fruitful questions for SFL. It might reveal complexity you've not seen before, such as issues around consistency that you raise for yourself. Okay, so I'm going to introduce some LCT concepts and use them. I'm already behind where I wanted to be, but there we go. So LCT currently has 3 main active dimensions. There's more on the way. Each dimension is has a set of principles, or looks at a set of principles, what are called legitimation codes, and people use different parts of the toolkit depending upon the problem. Today I'm going to focus entirely on autonomy, and just one part of it, autonomy codes. And I'm going to start by defining some concepts rather abstractly, and then I'm going to show how they work with a series of real examples. So if you don't get them to start with, you should get them after the examples, and you can always read them at your leisure. So autonomy begins from the very simple premise that a set of practices is made up of constituents or parts, and that those constituents are related together in various ways. They could be people, ideas, machine parts, body movements, anything. The constituents and how they're related together could be explicit procedures, formal rules, tacit ways of working. And autonomy explores the issue of insulation. It asks, how insulated are a set of practices from others? How strongly bounded are they from other practices? And to answer that, it considers how insulated are the constituents, and how insulated are the ways those constituents are related together. And positional autonomy refers to the strength of boundaries between constituents within a contextual category and those positioned elsewhere. So for example, if my actions effectively say there should be stronger boundaries between what's positioned here and what goes somewhere else, that's stronger positional autonomy, or PA+. And relational autonomy is about how those constituents are related together. So for example, if my actions say there should be stronger boundaries between how we do things here and how they're done somewhere else, that'd be stronger relational autonomy, or RA+. So each of those can be stronger or weaker, and we can describe a continuum of strengths of positional autonomy and relational autonomy, and that gives us four main what are called autonomy codes, which I'm going to briefly define and then use to analyze some teaching practice. So sovereign codes are where both positional and relational autonomy are both strongly insulated positions, inward-looking principles. So what's valued comes from within the contextual category, stronger PA, and acts according to its own ways of working, stronger relational autonomy. And as I said, examples are coming. Exotic codes are the opposite. They draw on things from elsewhere, weaker positional autonomy, and they put those practices to some other use, weaker relational autonomy. Introjected codes are where practices come from outside, but they're turned to a purpose that comes from here. They're turned to purpose, our purpose is here. And the last one, projected codes are the other way around. So they're where we take practices from here and we use them for some other purpose. Now, like all LCT codes, this is a topology. These are not four boxes. There are infinite positions on the plane. This is an old one I always use, but I am actually, in fact, currently doing an analysis of the various elements of video animations that involves not exactly a scatter pattern, but it certainly involves a synoptic view which has all parts of the animation all over the plane. So you don't put a thing in a box. So something like the video animations I'm analyzing right now may have a bunch of codes involved in them. The same thing with a lesson or a text or whatever. So that's one way we can use them. It's not the way I'm going to use today. I'll jump over that. What I'm going to do is trace pathways. This is what we call pathways, which are movements around the plane, movements from one code to another, like these two. So these are the actual two I'm going to use. So one's called an autonomy tour. It doesn't have to involve those three in that order, but it will today. An autonomy tour is simply where you start in one code, you go somewhere else, and you end up back at the original code. That's a tour. And a one-way trip, it's a one-way trip. You start in one code, you go to another code, you do not go back. You do not come back. So that's what I'm going to look at today. How I'm going to use them? Well, LCT concepts, autonomy codes, specialization codes, semantic codes, they can all be used to look at almost anything. So they're very abstract. And so we often develop what's called a translation device, a means of being able to relate them to specific data, because they're not like, say, the appraisal system or anything like that. They are more like, I don't know, perhaps maybe I'm wrong, but they might be more like straight or rank or metafunctions or something like that. They're quite high up. They're quite far away from the empirical. So we have to say how we're going to use them here. How I'm going to use them here is to analyze the knowledge practice of teachers in a classroom where they're doing teaching practice. And so I'm going to be asking where the content comes from. If it comes from within what we call the target, it's stronger positional autonomy. If it comes from somewhere else, it's weaker positional autonomy. And relational autonomy here is about the purposes to which it's put. So if it's for teaching and learning the target knowledge, it's going to be stronger relational autonomy. If it's some other purpose, it's weaker. The last thing I'll just very briefly mention is a target. I think it's probably the most important concept in autonomy. And here I'm just going to race past it. You can read about it at length. In general terms, a target is what makes a context or category distinctive. It's what makes this a talk and not a birthday party or something else. We know LCT is a sociological framework. It's socially aware, just like SFL. It knows that what is a party or a lecture or whatever it might be is socially constructed and subject to change. So we don't make any we don't define things, what's in or out. We don't say this is science, that's maths, this is history, that's everyday. We look at how the participants construct those boundaries, and that's what's called a target. In this case, we analyzed what teachers plan to do using interviews and all their course materials, and we identified what they saw as their target, what makes their lessons distinctive, what they're trying to do in this. And that helped us create a translation device for relating these concepts to our data. This is it. I don't want to bog down too much in this, but it basically defines, it's a way of carving up the continuum so that we can allocate our data into stronger or weaker, or 4 levels, in fact, should we need to. How many levels? There are, in fact, other more levels as well if you go to a 3rd level of the translation device. How many you use depends on your object of study and your problem. Here, our teachers saw their target as New South Wales Stage 4 history or science syllabus, because we studied history and science teachers. And that's years 7 and 8 in school, and everything else is weaker. So if it's content from that, it's stronger positional autonomy. So positional autonomy is stronger when they or their students discuss knowledge from that syllabus, and it's weaker when they discuss anything else. And second, I just realized I don't know if you can see me waving around my cursor on your screen, but there you go. Second, they describe their target purpose as teaching that content. So relational autonomy is stronger when they're using whatever they're talking about to teach the syllabus. So stronger plus, and it's weaker when they're doing something else.
Just to assure you, Karl, we can see you waving, and it's great. You are communicating wonderfully with your hands. Thanks.
Oh, okay, good. And if I point that way, it's because my screen is there and I forget that you can't see it with my PowerPoints. So we can, that's a bit crude, plus, stronger or weaker. We can go further, we can distinguish, we can expand a little on different parts of the target. So for example, here, core target is the specific unit of study being taught. And one of the examples I'll talk about is the ancient world. And ancillary are other targets, other topics from the target, such as medieval world or anything else from the wider syllabus. So the point here is that that's how we've done it here. Now, as I said, I'm in the middle of analyzing animations used in specific tasks in classes, and we use it differently there. We use these different levels. Target is the lesson, not the unit. Oh, sorry, the target is the target level. The first level is at the level of the lesson, and then core target and that second level, ancillary target and so on, they are at the level of task. So what levels we use this at depends on our object of study. But here, in these examples, it's at the level of the unit. Level of syllabus and then unit. Now, non-target is anything else that's not the target, but we can break that up. It's not just a blob, usually things that are outside of what something's trying to do. It just becomes a kind of miscellaneous category, but we can actually see there are things that are closer or further away from the target. And here we describe the associated non-target as being other educational knowledge. We view that as being closer to the target than knowledge from outside education. That's just a way, these kind of distinctions, just a way of being able to get us a systematic means of analyzing different kinds of knowledge being expressed in terms of their strengths of positional autonomy and relational autonomy. And then we can see what changes happen in the nature of the knowledge. And then we can see what might be the secret of success for integrating different forms of knowledge. So there's a purpose to all this, not just labeling. Okay, so you've patiently listened to lots of theory. I'm going to give you some actual examples. These come from the PEAK project that was led by myself and Jim Martin and Sarah Howard and Len Unsworth. which looked at whole units of study in science and history through years 7, 8, and 9 in different schools. I'm going to focus on history and science in year 7, and I'm going to discuss 2 examples in which teachers bring together different kinds of knowledge, everyday knowledge and history knowledge in history, and then how they brought maths together with science in science. And I'm going to trace the pathways very briefly of those teachers and show how an autonomy tour, which I showed you earlier, and you'll see again, can help build knowledge from diverse sources, and a one-way trip prevents the building of knowledge. So I'm going to begin by contrasting 2 history teachers from different schools. They're pretty much alike in every other way. They're the same year of school. They see their target as teaching and learning the state history syllabus. They have the same state history syllabus, and the specific unit of study that they're studying is the ancient world. That's their core target. So they're very similar. In my first example, they're both year 7, I should say. They're both, in the first example, a teacher will draw on geography and politics and everyday life, and she's going to take her students on a one-way trip out of history, and she doesn't return. She doesn't return to a target content or a target purpose, and it kind of breaks down. So here's the example. We're at the start of the lesson, and she has written down on the whiteboard today's question, which is, where was ancient Rome? And then she puts up a map that's called the Roman Empire. She puts that up on the interactive whiteboard, and she says, this tells us that the Romans, the people who are from Rome, they didn't just have one city, it expanded. The places where they lived expanded, and they had a whole empire, which means a huge area of land where they spread out and they owned it all and they lived. So she begins deep inside what we call the sovereign code, her sovereign code. It's content from syllabus about ancient history, it's a stronger positional autonomy, and it's for the purpose of learning about ancient history, stronger relational autonomy. And it's right over there. It's actually right in her core target because it's in the unit. She then displays a map of modern Europe with Italy highlighted, and she says, so this is now modern, not ancient, but modern. This, she points to the map, is Rome, the city, and this, she gestures more widely, is the whole country, is Italy. This whole country is Italy, the country. And she continues, so the capital city is Rome, like our capital city is Canberra, and this whole country is colored in orange. And if you see the map I put on your desk, she says, you can see they've written Italia, because that's how the Italians said the name of their country. So a use of a modern map, the modern idea of capital cities, and the examples of Canberra, and the modern nation state of Italy, are all content from beyond her target of the history syllabus. They're not the ancient world, they're weaker positional autonomy. She could have taken the example of Canberra as the capital city of Australia and turned it to the purpose of explaining relations between the city of Rome and the whole Roman Empire, but she didn't make that link. So the purpose remains weaker relational autonomy. If she'd done that, she would have what's called introjected. She would have moved into an introject. She would have moved over this way she would have strengthened relational autonomy, but she didn't do that. So she's over here. She's just inside the exotic code. It's still educational knowledge mainly. So she's moved into an exotic code. She then says, and there's nothing wrong with that, as we'll see. She then says, does anybody know this? Italy is easy to spot because it's the shape of something. And a student replies, a boot. And just in case you can't remember what Italy looks like, that's what it looks like. So that's why they're saying it looks like a boot. And she continues, yes, a boot. See how this is a lady's high-heeled boot? There's the high heel, there's the toe, and it's a big, long boot. Can everyone see that? And the student asks, Miss, what's the top then? Oh, I don't know. Just pretend. Up until about there, it's a boot. So by using the shape of boots to identify modern Italy on a map, she's further weakened positional autonomy and relational autonomy. So both the content and the purpose are now beyond education. She's deeply inside an exotic code. Now, again, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And the second example in history is going to do the same thing. Drawing on everyday knowledge can help students engage and provide a way into the complex constellations of knowledge that are academic disciplines. The problem here is the teacher is not able to bring those ideas back to help students understand the history she wants them to learn. She tries to bring them back. She retraces her steps to strengthen positional autonomy. She moves from the boot through the location of modern Italy and the idea of a capital city back to reach ancient Rome. She says, so the city is Rome, but now in the modern day, the whole country is Italy. Do you get it? Okay, but we're talking about ancient Rome. Look at this, it's massive. Here's Italy with the boot, but all of the red parts were owned by the Romans. And she also, so she's trying to get back. She also tries to strengthen relational autonomy by reminding students of her target purpose. She says she will be asking them, where was ancient Rome? So she's trying to get back. She strengthened the positional autonomy. She moved that way. And then she moved that way. So combined over to here, she's trying to get back, but the students don't follow her. They stay down in here, right down in here, as they attempt to find boots on maps. So a series of students ask for her help to find a boot, or they question whether the shape she's pointing to looks like a boot. I can't find the boot on the paper. The boot is the white one. You found it? That was a boot? There's lots of them. Students finding boots all over the place. Look, that's where you put your foot, and so on, and so on. And the students spend a while searching for boots on maps. And then the teacher returns after a number of minutes to what she calls today's question, which was, where was ancient Rome? And she says, it will now be discussed another day. It won't be today's question after all. So what happens is that we have a one-way trip here out of history. It began in the sovereign code. It moved to just inside an exotic code, and then it kept going and didn't come back. She tried to retrace her steps. The students didn't come with her. So knowledge from geography and knowledge from everyday life did not become integrated with the history knowledge, because the ability to find a boot shape on a map remained very strongly segmented from the knowledge of ancient Rome that she wanted them to learn. So that, in that case, different kinds of knowledge coming together didn't happen. Let's compare that with the strategies of a different teacher. Same target, same core target. She looks at Sparta rather than Rome. That's all. That's the only difference, really. And she's discussing how government works in Rome. Like the previous one, she draws on the students' everyday understandings, and it begins with her discussing the Garuzia, I think it's pronounced, a group that shapes law and policy in Sparta, and how they made decisions differently to another group called the Ephors. And she said, it's not like the Ephorate, because the Ephors can actually say yes or no right at the end. Do we ever say yes or no in Australia? Sometimes. Sometimes. When sometimes? What's it called? Do you know? A referendum. A referendum, yes, well done. So this begins deep inside her sovereign code. Both the content and the purpose were about the ancient Rome, the ancient world, sorry, Sparta. And the teacher then shifts deep into an exotic code. She asks the students about the non-target content of whether yes, no voting happens in Australia and what its name is. And she does that for the purpose of clarifying whether yes, no votes occur today. In fact, she makes this move again, actually. She says, some people look at the Garuzia and say, well, they're not really having a debate because they can only say yes or no. Well, we have referendums where we want to change our constitution, and in a referendum, the government can only ask you a question where you say yes or no. So she's shifting again from the sovereign code to the exotic code, deep inside it too. She's just shifting between syllabus knowledge about ancient Greek government, everyday knowledge about modern Australian politics, not explicitly connecting them yet, just putting them next to each other. But then she does, I said yet, because she pivots to her target purpose. She says, and that's the exact same thing in Sparta. So she turns the discussion of modern Australia, which is non-target content, to her target purpose of learning and teaching and learning about ancient Greece. So she interjects it. She shifts into an interjected code. And that's where you bring in ideas from outside and you turn them to the purpose. You turn them to your purpose. From here, she then quickly moves on to a sovereign code by returning to her target content and purpose. She says, when the discussion is held, they come and they present things to them at their meeting, and then they say to them, do you want this or not? But they don't stand up and yell, stand up and down and yell yes or no. They do it by who gets the loudest clapping. So this is brought back into discussing ancient Greece for the purpose of learning about ancient Greece. So she basically brings in everyday ideas, but then she takes the students on an autonomy tour. She moves out of her sovereign code. I don't know which way around this will be on your computer, but she moves out of her sovereign code into an exotic code, modern Australian politics. She turns that to the purpose of teaching ancient Greece, shifting to an integrated code, and then she's back to, an interjected code, then she's back to her sovereign code. And she does this over and over and over again. It's like a signature move for her. I won't go into this. I'll try and do this as quickly as possible, but basically, straight on from the end of the last quote, where she was in a sovereign code, she goes out again to an exotic code, asking them about whether they want happy dance music. And then she turns that to the purpose of illustrating the Spartan voting system. And then they move back up to talking about Sparta again. She does this over and over and over again, one tour after another, and it's all the same pathway to. It's the same, almost a signature for her tour. Why she do that? Well, she's by leaving her sovereign code, she's making it more accessible. As I said, there's nothing wrong. Staying in your sovereign code forever would be deathly dull. And she's providing accessible ways in for students to understand the history knowledge she wants them to learn. But to make those analogies and those examples work, she brings them back to that history knowledge. She interjects and she integrates. She does an autonomy tour rather than a one-way trip. And that's the simple message of studies of classrooms and elsewhere so far that we're finding. There's more in the stuff that we're working on right now, and will be out in all good and evil bookstores in about 9 months' time, 10 months' time, a book called Teaching Science, which will have more on this sort of thing. But studies are suggesting that integrative knowledge building, bringing together different kinds of knowledge, you need to get out, in order to be able to do that at all, you need to get out from your target and get over to somewhere else. You need to travel, but you also need to bring those lessons home. So you need to take your readers and your students on an autonomy tour. You need to go out to other content, to other purposes or other purposes and come back. You don't have to do it in that particular model of those three, but which I'm using today, and I'm going to use again in the science example. You can, I've got another example, many other examples where people just zip on a return trip. They go from one code to another. But the thing is, you've got to bring it back. You've got to come back to where you started and connect it up. You've got to connect it up. Okay, let's have a look at science and something that doesn't involve everyday knowledge. This is something I've written at greater length about in the book I just mentioned, which is also full up with amazing stuff that will blow your mind about SFL. And I won't be talking about that right now. By Jim and Yagan and Jing Hao and many others, Sue and David and so on. So maths in science. I'm going to look at how maths and science are brought together. Again, this is year 7. Again, the two examples are very similar. Same target, state syllabus for science, same core target, unit of study called, it's actually called Earth and Space Sciences. And they're both looking at what's called the inner core target is they're looking at why the Earth has seasons. And the first example is an autonomy tour. The students have done an experiment into the effect of the angle of sunlight on the temperature of the Earth. They used a lamp for the sun, a wooden block for the Earth, and they placed the lamp at different angles, and they recorded the temperature at the start and after 2.5 minutes and after 5 minutes. Prior to that, they'd written a hypothesis of what they think would happen. And that was all done in the previous lesson. And I'm going to now analyze the first 35 minutes of the next lesson, in which the teacher gets them to turn that table of results that they've done from that into a graph, and then talks about what that graph is showing. So she begins by recounting the experiment and asking students about their findings. She says, we did an experiment where we measured temperature, and we shone a torch at a block, and we changed the angle of the block, and we measured how much the temperature changed. So who can give me a statement about what the results did? And a student says, as the angle of the block increased, the temperature increased. And the teacher loved that statement. She goes on to ask other students after that, but she really loved that statement. We are deep inside her sovereign code here. She then says, we're going to graph. I want you to think about the graphing rules. Now, graphing is often associated with mathematics, so this raises the question of whether it's inside or outside her target. If you do what just about, well, a lot of people have done, many people have done, particularly philosophically, is if you try to define mathematics or science, you will just tie yourself in knots. Maths is a key language for science. They're often intertwined. There's no way, and there's no way of being able to say this is forever and essentially maths, and this is forever and essentially not maths in terms of science. It's now science has been absorbed into science. With autonomy codes, we just go around this minefield. We just look at what the target tells us. And the teacher said her target was stage 4 science syllabus. The stage 4 science syllabus for New South Wales has a strand called science inquiry skills, which includes construct and use a range of representations, including graphs, to represent and analyze patterns or relationships in the data. So graphing might be in her target. But it depends. The syllabus makes clear that science inquiry skills like this are those which give students tools they need to achieve deeper understanding of science concepts. So graphing is part of the syllabus when it is closely integrated with learning what it calls the science knowledge in the syllabus, such as factors shaping Earth's seasons. So it's not a case of graphing is maths, so outside a target, or graphing is science, so it's inside a target. It's a matter of how graphing is discussed and used. It can be inside or outside. She can basically describe it, discuss it, construe it, using a much loved SFL word, construe it in a way which is either inside or outside her target. In this case, she begins by recounting the graphing rules completely separately from a discussion of anything to do with syllabus knowledge. She discusses with students the graphing rules in terms of the axes of a graph, X and Y, and where the independent variable and where the dependent variable goes. She says, so who can remind me of what the rules are for graphing? Y versus X, says a student. Y versus X. How do we know which goes where? The independent variable goes on one side. Yes, that's good. And the dependent variable goes on the other one. The thing that is the most regular, which is usually your IV, your independent variable, goes on your X, and your DV goes on the Y. Now, as content, this is related to Earth seasons. Sorry, unrelated to Earth seasons. So it's weaker positional autonomy. And its purpose here is to recap the graphing rules, not to learn anything about Earth seasons. So it's an exotic code. But she then says, now in this experiment, who can tell me there's a little problem? Have a look at our data. Can you tell me which one goes on the x-axis and which goes on the y-axis? And students give various suggestions. And then they realize there's too many variables. And she explains, so in this experiment, we've got 3 sets of data. And she goes on to explain what they need to do. Now, the content here, locating variables, is not related to what the experiment will show about Earth seasons. So it's non-target content. It's down here, it's weaker positional autonomy. But she's turned it to the purpose of creating a graph that will show that knowledge. It's stronger relational autonomy. She's interjecting that external, outside mathematics knowledge. She's saying, in this experiment, bringing it over, changing the purpose. Now, in the history tour, that was a step that in one of them, the first one I looked at, that was a few seconds. It was like half a dozen words. Here, the teachers and the students remain in the interjected code for 15 minutes, working on their graphs, having discussions about that. And she tells students where the time and the temperature should go and how many lines they need to draw and that sort of thing. All of this content, absolutely unrelated to Earth seasons, all for the purpose of showing what the experiment reveals about that issue. So should they stay in the interjected code for all that time? And then the students, when they finish, the teacher then shifts the class back to a sovereign code. She gets the students to write a conclusion in their workbooks about what the graphs show. They discuss whether this supports or refutes the hypothesis they made before the experiment and how they might improve the experiment and test the ideas further. And then she integrates the graphing of the experiment back into a discussion of Earth seasons. She asks the students, are we really interested in a block and a lamp? Obviously, no. And she gets the students to remember the term model and reminds them it was the model of the sun and the earth. And she goes on to discuss how this model is different from reality and what that difference means for the role of sunlight in Earth's seasons. So over the course of 35 minutes, which I've condensed, obviously, the class has gone on an autonomy tour. So it doesn't happen just in seconds. It can also happen in longer periods. For those people who know semantic waves, you can have a wave that lasts, like 30 seconds. You can have a wave that lasts a year. You can have a wave that lasts a lifetime. So there are different levels. And in this case, it's 35 minutes, this one. They began on an autonomy tour. They began in the sovereign code with the results of the experiment. She went out to an exotic code to discuss graphing rules, very separate. They would turn to the purpose of creating a graph for the results of the experiment. And then that was integrated back into the discussion of Earth seasons. Why, by the way, would she leave her sovereign code at all? Why construct graphing rules as separate from science? Why do you need to leave? Why not talk about graphing in relation to the experiment from the start? Well, by keeping graphing knowledge separate before interjecting it, she's able to make clear how this graph is different because there's 3 sets of data. In other words, constructing the graphing rules as outside her target allows her to choose knowledge from graphing and recontextualize that knowledge into what she's teaching in ways appropriate to her target knowledge. In other words, she separated 2 kinds of knowledge in order to better integrate. Let's have a quick look in the last part of this talk at a slightly different example. another teacher using maths and science. Students have previously worked out the distances, some distances between planets, and now they're working on relative distances. And the teacher says, this is a different teacher now. So what we're going to do is we're going to put the distances and the sizes relative to Earth, okay? So we're going to put all the planets and the distance to the sun, and we're going to make them relative to the Earth. This is sovereign code. They're exploring content about the solar system for the purpose of learning about the solar system in the unit that I mentioned earlier on called Earth and Space Sciences. And then the teacher projects a table onto the whiteboard with the sun and the planets as this row here, columns for radius and distance from the sun and orbit and axis. And he adds these two in pen on the whiteboard, diameters as percentage of the Earth and distance as percentage of the Earth's. And it's those two columns he wants the students to figure out. So he immediately, and these are all blank, they've got to fill those in their workbooks. So he immediately shifts the discussion at that point, as they're going to do that, into an exotic code. He could position this anywhere, but he goes into an exotic code, and it is a him this time. He weakens positional autonomy by repeatedly describing the contents of the table as information. He says it over and over again, information, separating the content from learning about Earth's seasons. Indeed, he keeps emphasizing this point, responding to queries from students about the task. He says, so just do the last two. So just do the last two columns and then two more, add two more, because we're going to do some maths in the last two. So he says, we're going to do maths. He repeatedly says, we're going to do maths. So far, by the way, that's exactly the same pathway as the previous teacher, from sovereign to exotic code. The previous teacher then turned that non-target content of graphing to the purpose of learning about Earth seasons, interjecting it as a prelude then to integrating it. This teacher doesn't do that. He keeps the students in an exotic code. So the students copy down the numbers for about 10 minutes. He then tells them how to fill the columns, but it's in a way that's entirely detached from the content or learning about the Earth seasons. He says, divide that number by that number for the distance and that number by that number for the diameter. All right, that's what you're supposed to be doing. He refers to the content as number or information, and he says the purpose is working out the percentage. After almost 40 minutes, he asks the students to call out the numbers for the first column. He then asks, what do these percentages actually mean? Aha, this is an opportunity for turning this to the purpose of learning about the Earth. This is a prime chance here to interject all this stuff towards his target, and indeed his core target purpose. A student suggests a lot of numbers, that's what it means, and the teacher just moves on to giving instructions for calculating the second column. And the whole process then repeats, so he doesn't move anywhere. And after nearly an hour, the activity is brought to a close by the teacher stating, I know it's confusing, and saying that they will move on to another topic in the next lesson. So the autonomy pathway here is a one-way trip out of science, which is the target for the student, teacher, and into calculating numbers. So leaving his target to enter another kind of knowledge was not the first step to integrating. The maths he says they're doing is not related to or integrated into the syllabus, what the syllabus calls science knowledge, and those two remain completely segmented from each other. So what does all that mean? So to conclude, what I've been arguing is twofold. First, that a key attribute of building with different forms of knowledge and bringing them together, and it also can be different other things, different kinds of people, different kinds of practices, different kinds of whatever it might be you're analyzing. You need to travel. You need to do an autonomy tour. If you're going to integrate them, you need to travel. You need to embrace, in this case, different knowledges, different ways of working, but you need to return to your target content and your target purpose. You need to bring it all back home. If you're a Bob Dylan fan, whatever you define as your target. That's blindingly obvious, but as we've often found in our research, it's often missed in classrooms, and it's often missed in research too. Scholars shift between kinds of knowledge without bringing them into fruitful relations. You can read many examples of scholars writing, and they might bring in an everyday example, or they might move from a theory, a concept to data, or back again, and they don't actually interject them. They don't interject or integrate them. They just kind of shove them next to each other. My second point is that, or different disciplines, for example, and a collection that's interdisciplinary can often be like. My second point is that we can use these concepts to track autonomy pathways, and we can show what success actually means in any specific context. And then we can teach that to newcomers, such as students. I don't have time to do this today, but we've been using the concept to analyze student assessments, and that shows that some pathways are more valued than others. We analyzed a science assessment in which students pretend to be scientists reporting to a government about the effects of a change in the Earth's tilt, and that involves at least 3 autonomy codes, and the teacher valued the highest those students who did all of them and in the right order, in a particular order. One pathway of moving around the knowledge was valued more than others for that assessment. So this kind of analysis can reveal the rules of the game, as we call it in LCT, that often remain hidden. So we can use these to help students succeed in education. Okay, finally, what does any of that mean for SFL? I'm scratching my head, which is very apt, because I haven't got a clue. But we can guess. If we think back to where I began, I said there are 2 ways LCT and LCFL influence each other. The first way is by bringing together their analyses to generate greater explanatory power. The ideas I've discussed here allow us to analyze knowledge practices. These can be integrated with SFL analysis of linguistic resources that might be generating autonomy tours or that lead to one-way trips or other pathways. And by revealing those resources, SFL would greatly enhance our understanding of how to teach students and teach teachers to achieve these tours, which will provide another key to achievement for students and enable both students and teachers to integrate different kinds of knowledge successfully. So the first implication is it might offer another set of complementary tools for scholars and educators in SFL, similar to how semantic waves and semantic profiling have led to lots and lots of productive research and practice together, using both those approaches together. And the second way in which SFL and LCT influence each other was to raise fundamental questions for the other theory. What questions might this raise for SFL? As I said, fundamental questions for a framework are raised by those within it, those working with that framework. They know where the top people know where all the holes are, or all the problems, or how it might be upsetting things or whatever. But not just the top. Anybody, I mean, anybody who's well versed in a theory can start to feel where its limits are, where it's stretching. And sometimes those are shown by things you can't do with it that you want to do. Now, I don't know about SFL. Sometimes people in education or in sociology call me like a linguist or a sociolinguist simply because I take language seriously. But I'm not a linguist. I'm a sociologist. I do not understand SFL well enough to know what questions this raises or how to solve them. I asked my very good friend, I don't know why there's a full stop after the word Jim in this slide, but there you go. I asked my very good friend, Jim Maton, and he told me what he thought it might raise as questions, and I wrote down what I could remember from that, which was something Halliday and Hassan, 1976, something texture, something cohesion, something context of situation, something consistent, something register, something field, something mode, something tenor, something genre staging, and some other words. All said with that unmistakable Canadian accent. So I don't know, but from discussions with Jim, he suggests these ideas might raise the question of what consistent in register means, especially in complex text. So for example, in the autonomy tour in science, there's maths, there's science, and field, you've got experiments, graphs, descriptions. In mode, you've got monologues, discussions, students having fun, and more. In tenor, what makes one consistent or successful, perhaps, is another way of calling it, another not. And Jim tells me these complex and shifting arrangements of field, mode, and tenor are not easily predicted by genre staging. So why should some of them serve teaching and learning in a field and others not? How do we figure out which is which and why? Why did an analogy between Italy and a boot fail, but another analogy in another lesson succeed? So these are the kinds of questions these concepts might raise. But as I say, I'm not able to answer those questions or even to raise them. You are. So instead, I just offer these ideas from LCT as an invitation to take an autonomy tour yourself. So one leading from your sovereign code of SFL into the exotic code of LCT. It's very exotic down here in LCT, I can tell you. And then back home again, having hopefully found something useful along the way. Thank you for listening. Sally, are you there?
I'm here, Karl.
Oh, Sue's here.
Thank you, Sue, for jumping in there. I couldn't unmute myself. I've just grown up to 2 screens and can't get from one to the other very easily. So I was also very, I was reading the chat room and trying to think. So I'm going to hand over to Sue because I think she's got a question or a comment.
Okay. Okay.
A thought, or no, some thoughts. I mean, in my head, I run through some of the lecture data that I've, know inside out, and what these lecturers are doing, and there's sort of really obvious tours from sovereign to exotic, whereas something, it's more kind of, I'm probably using your terms wrongly, but there's a sort of axiological kind of motivation in a sense. So what I mean by that is, so there's a shift in field to something that is everyday, something that is, it seems, is likely to, the lecture kind of assumes this is going to be a shared field with the students, some common sense field. So it's kind of also linking into what's going on in terms of semantic codes and so on, as they make that shift. But it's the question of then that in that exotic code, there's something that is, so some kind of values are expressed, values associated with that being in the exotic code, that field, that generates humor, or it's as though it's not that tour is made for some kind of purpose of affiliating with the students, not in relation to the sovereign code at all. It does something else, and then it's finished and back. So it's not so much a shift that's related to knowledge building in relation to the sovereign code. So
yeah, I mean, yeah, no, and that's really interesting. I mean, there's a couple of things there. Firstly, that's where, I mean, the great thing about the dimensions is that you can use them together in sort of, infinite combinations in terms of like what they, what can be used with what for what. I mean, I should say, by the way, please don't ever anybody just try and stick them together like two wires and say, oh, I've come up with something called the epistemic positional autonomy. It's utter bullshit, because that's just like wiring together two different things that have absolutely nothing to do with each other. One has to be really careful to divide in order to bring together, exactly the same as these autonomy tours are doing. But in this case, one can just use the autonomy tour to look at autonomy planes and autonomy pathways to look at particular things happening in terms of those boundaries to do with the content, to do with the purpose. And then bring in something like specialization and say, well, look, that exotic code, that non-target purpose that they used it for there was here, was, that part of it was to do with maybe they were, maybe the non-target, I'll say non-target content would be easier. The non-target content that they brought in. So let's just, hang on a second. It'd be easier if I found myself a little, let's just use that one. So ignoring all the rest of this slide, I'm on my shared screen still. If we were in here and say we went down to here to the introjected code, and now that content might be from another discipline. It might be from everyday experiences or something like that. It may shift specialization code, down in like science to maths. It's all knowledge code, when it shifts in terms of going inside and outside the content, the target content. But in terms of, but it might be to everyday knowledge. It might be to experiences. Tell us how you feel about whatever it might be. So there may be a specialization code shift. And the same thing with the purpose. It might be a specialization code shift happening there, where you're going from, I want to teach the kids about how to do a specific thing with some lab equipment, or I want to teach them about how to solve differential equations or whatever it might be. Very knowledge codey. And then in the midst of that, you kind of go out into an exotic code or some other code. You go out to something else, like to say, oh, or making a joke about something or other, in order to engage and to kind of bond in that kind of sense. So yes, it could be that you shift straight out into a Noah code, into a different kind of thing.
I mean,
and whether that's able to be interjected, turned to purpose or not, whether it needs to be. Not everything might need it. Sometimes it could be useful for just as a kind of like a little gap between things. I mean, like in this example, in this analysis, and in the papers in which this have been written up, I'm trying to show a simple thing, like autonomy tours might be useful, one-way trips maybe not. Here's some concepts, here's how they can be used. But it's unbelievably not the case that this is the panacea or the one way of teaching. And for example, having a nice little, like palate cleanser between two different things could be really valuable. Like you could be doing one thing, go out into an exotic code, have a bit of a joke and everything, and like ease the tension in the room.
Yeah.
Like as a break, to then come back to another thing. So not everything has to be woven in. And not things can serve different purposes, but for the purpose of weaving things together, you do need to interject and integrate. Now, that may involve specialization code shifts, which becomes, and they also will maybe involve semantic code shifts. So what we can start to see is that in doing this, what teachers are doing and what authors are doing and what speakers are doing and researchers are doing is actually quite complex. They may be, as they move from one thing, a person who does an analogy that works really well, maybe shifting semantic codes, they may be shifting specialization codes, they may be shifting autonomy codes, and don't even get me into temporal codes. And then, so that's actually quite a lot of work. I mean, they're not sitting there having to think about all this stuff, but no. it's more, they're not going, oh, that code's sorted, but it can show you just how complex the changing in the knowledge is. So yes, absolutely, is a short answer. I've given a long answer, but a short response to your question is to say, or comment is to say, yep, absolutely. There are specialization code shifts going on all the time. And one of the kind of challenges in a way of developing or using concepts like this in LCT is to put that aside. So while you're doing it, so when I was analyzing these lessons, I analyzed them along 5 different dimensions, actually, all at the same time, which almost made my brain explode. And then had to just try to forget about all the other codes that are changing in order to see what's happening on the autonomy code front. So yeah, there's all sorts of things going on. I agree.
And images as well. I mean, it's the example I had in mind was this lecture, and it was my famous, urine formation lecture. And it's all about, one of the features of one of the body parts that's involved. There's a technical term, fenestration, and the lecturer says, a slide comes up and there's a technical slide that has these images of this body part and its little holes in this piece, and the next one comes up and it's got beside it an image of a window and a cat sitting on the windowsill. And one of the students says, what's that cat? So he says, oh, well, fenestration means window. And so I want to find a picture of a window. And I like cats, so I found one with a cat in it, at which point the students laugh, so it's kind of gone to I suppose that I'm still very much learning this. So kind of an interjection, that is the idea of window meaning fenestration. Something
outside being turned to purpose, being interjected in to
and then over to the exotic. So even like in the visual data collecting, how these autonomy tours are mapped onto.
Absolutely. Like images, gestures, everything, like how these things work. I mean, as I mentioned a couple of times, because I'm in the middle of it, so it's in my brain. I'm doing this stuff on this, writing about these video animations used in science lessons, and they involve images, moving images. They involve audio, special sound effects, visual effects, all sorts of elements of various kinds. And they are scattered all across the autonomy plane, because not everything fits a task. I mean, an animation just does not, and you know, the teacher hasn't sat there and made specifically for their task in that space. There's often things that don't match it, and you know, that don't serve the purpose, or they have content like glowing or sound effects or whatever that is definitely not in the target content, but it might be turned to the target purpose. So it is really, you know, quite complex, but I try to keep it as simple as I possibly can. In order just to try and get a simple answer out. I just want to answer one question somebody asked in chat, which I haven't kept up with.
Good. I'm trying to bring some of the chat questions to your attention, but yes.
Yes, can somebody save this when we get to the end, please, and send it to me so that I can have a look, and I might be able to answer a couple of those at some point in the future, which is, somebody asked can the only teachers shift the autonomy curve? And
that's what I was
going to, no, absolutely. So, I mean, one of the things about autonomy tours, autonomy pathways as a method, and target as the key issue, is that there's the target's always someone's target. So if you look at the paper Taking Autonomy Tours, the word target shouldn't appear. I'm gonna have to make sure that it doesn't, shouldn't appear without someone's name before it or some things before it. It's someone's target, the teacher's target in this case. Now the students may have a totally different target. They might have like what they distinct, you know, what them is distinguishing this is, you know, that they're gonna try and I don't know, they're just going to try and get through it, or it might be terrible, whatever it might be. Like finding boots on a map, that's what they thought their target was at one point in that history class. So they had a very different conception of the target. Now the thing is, which target we choose as the basis to set the plane. Where's north? We have to have something to set the plane somewhere as plus or minus stronger or weaker on the positional or relational autonomy, right? So we decide whose target first, whose target we're going to follow. Now, in this case, the study is about how teachers teach. So we thought, fair enough, we're going to choose the teacher's target. That's the first thing we're going to look at. In another situation, it might be completely different. It might be somebody else's target. And then that gives us, but there may be more than one target. There's always probably more than one target in a context. And we just have to choose who's we're going to see, who's we're going to set. That doesn't mean that everyone else gets excluded. We can argue about, you know, we can describe how they have competing targets. But for this analysis, the target was the teachers. And then we decide what level to do it at, as I mentioned earlier on. Yeah, and somebody else asked, by the way.
Just before that, I think,
yes.
Can we just have one from off the board? Jim's got his hand up, I think.
Unmute. Start video.
Okay.
I was just going to follow on from your slide, filling in the holes of the something.
Jim, are you in some sort of Zen kendo?
That's a picture from a favorite winery in Argentina, a very chthonic triptych at the base of the Andes. So Sue says I can't show my underwear and dirty clothes in the background. So no, just historically, personally, and also in SFL, like the critical thing, one critical thing here is the notion of what a text is. This semantic unit that's supposed to be coherent in some respect. And if you do go back to the Halliday and Hassan, they say, okay, well, the text has to be cohesive and consistent in register. So then the question arises, we can do cohesion and all that, we've got scaffolding for that, but what does consistent in register mean when you have the kind of field shifting that you showed there? So that's a completely untheorized part of SFL, and it's very provocative what you're saying in terms of that. Then more practically speaking, if we think to pedagogy and Sydney School and all this sort of thing, and the question of a curriculum genre that's supposed to be governing generally what happens in a classroom, and you have a very blunt instrument called staging, which has a very general sort of breaking up of the lesson, but we know within the stages there's all kinds of field mode and tenor shifting, and what kind of field mode tenor shifting is actually effective in the service of things. And I think what you're doing is very provocative in terms of what kind of field shifts are actually marshaled effectively in a particular stage. And we could ask that question fractally in all kinds of ways. If you take David Rose's general notion that everything should be seen as a task, a little task, a medium-sized task, a big task. And our job is to prepare the students to be successful in the task and then elaborate the task. The question is, you have this task with a particular target and a particular kind of technicality or whatever it is you're worried about, but to prepare them, you have to bridge to that, and maybe they do the task, you have to again get out of that task and relate it to other things, and maybe even crank up the technicality or whatever. So the question is, how do you actually manage to shift in the preparation and elaboration? So there's a very deep theoretical historical question about what a text is, and there's very practical questions about how do we actually manage effective curriculum genres arising out of this. And it's a super great tool for starting to worry about things that we just don't cope with theoretically, and we don't cope with practically well enough at this stage.
Thank you, Jim. That's extraordinarily generous and fantastic of you to say. And I mean, and it is a really complicated issue. I mean, just like you know, from my crude tools only, as I said, I'm looking at something like a teacher using, as I said, I'm looking at the teacher using an animation, and I keep thinking of this because it's so complex in a miniature form. And you think, oh, well, they're just using a video, and then you find that the video itself has got all sorts of stuff in it. And then how do they fit that to or not? It's an extremely complex thing that's going on. And I don't think that we in sociology of education have got a clue about how that's done. So that's one of the reasons why I'm finding working with autonomy extremely interesting, because it's beginning to get a sense of why things work, as it were. If we take, say, the idea of consistently register as being, in my crude misunderstanding of it, as I exoticize the hell out of it, a kind of like, why does it work or why does it not? In the example of the animations, you've got just people in educational technology saying, this one works because it fits the task. This one doesn't because it doesn't. As you think, what huh? That's like, it's almost tautological in a sense. And having seen teachers screw up with multimedia objects I consider to be perfect for their task, and also somehow manage to make things that don't look like they should work at all, and they do, it's clear that there's a lot more going on here. There's a lot more pedagogic work going on, as you say, in, for example, the run up. So I'm using task in a very general sense rather than the very specific, the kind of sense of the reading to learn. But with that, you know, in the run up, as it were, and in the elaboration part as well, you've got a lot of pedagogic work to do to make that connect, and possibly autonomy might provide us a way of seeing some part of what's going on there. And one of the things that I'm kind of poking you to try and work with me on is, what are the semiotic resources that are achieving or failing at doing that? Because, you know, when people say you should use more everyday examples, use more analogies, yes, we've both seen, we sat there and watched them completely die or completely, you know, work perfectly. And I think there's something to do with interjection going on there, but how that's achieved, how these movements around the plane are achieved linguistically is really interesting.
How do you
to me.
semiotically scaffold a successful tour? I mean, that's
yes,
great question.
Yes,
great question.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I'm just basically going, look, these people who succeeded, that they went, look, they did these things and they did that thing and so on. Yeah. And then you say, how did they achieve that? I go, what? They just did these things. Look at the nice things that they did. I don't know how they got there. Not at that kind of level. So that's the wonders of the academic division of labor that I enjoy so much.
Yeah.
I wonder whether there's this notion of bridging, and I immediately comes to my mind of kind of bridging meta language, and how, you know, in conversations with Lucy McNaught and others, we've really teased this notion of bridging. It has to bridge to somewhere. It's not just renaming, you know, in SFL meta language, it's just not renaming something into a common sense term for its sake. It's, if you're going to sort of, you know, recontextualize in, you know, the various ways that we have to, it has to have kind of breadcrumbs back to the theory. And I wonder whether, you know, that might be a way of not necessarily with the meta language, but thinking about what are the breadcrumbs that are like the choice of example or the choice of analogy, you know, kind of, you know, what semiotically kind of ties it back to the sovereign, or in that sense.
Exactly. I mean, and it's going to be, I mean, I'm really hoping that I can kind of like poke and prod and provoke and perturb or whatever Jim enough to sort of like tease into this, get into this and start unpacking some of this, because I mean, not because I think SFL needs more concepts or that that, you know, I don't do SFL. So, you know, what you guys do, it's like, it's not the life or death for me. But when those things are teased out in SFL, what happens is, for me, to be really selfish, is that things start to open up that I don't see before. And then you start seeing that, for example, say I say the word introjection, which for me right now is a nice simple term. I move there to there, you know, I move from the left to the right-hand side of the plane. In any way, shape or form, I'm introjecting. Even if I'm not shifting code, I'm introjecting. That's lovely. And then it'll turn out, I'm sure, that the semantic resources for an analogy or for an example or for a metaphor, whatever it might be, are completely different. And so, or images or, you know, gesture. And suddenly it becomes more complicated and we have to start seeing how, and then of course the LCT concepts start to bend and warp, and I have to try and figure out how to, you know, and we together as a field, people like Yake and Doran and so on, and start figuring out how we can make sense of this stuff. So I think it's great. And so I hope that this stuff is going to be of interest to SFL, and but not just to reconfigure new concepts, but also in terms of like adding to the fantastically strong tradition of pedagogic support and pedagogic, I don't like pedagogic intervention as a term, but the kind of pedagogic professional development sort of work that SFL has been so amazingly strong at for such a long time. So I'm hoping that it may have potential use for that in the same way that Semantic Waves has.
I guess one of the questions that I've just been reading on the group chat too, that's of course you know, provoking to all of us, is thinking, you know, Daniel says it's interesting to consider that the teacher's intended tour may not be what the students experience, you know, that notion, or their intended tour as well.
Absolutely. So I mean, I in those simple examples, I was tracing what the knowledge expressed by the teacher, with a little bit of the students to show that they weren't going to follow the teacher back. Because actually, if I just focused on the teacher in the boot example, Italy and the boot in history, the teacher she returned. She did a return trip. She went all the way back from the boot to ancient Rome. She did. It's the students themselves that didn't go back. Now they are going to be experiencing it as a very different kettle of fish, and different students will experience different things as well. So yes, absolutely. What the pathway or the profile or whatever it might be of a set of codes of the knowledge being expressed by a teacher may be completely different to that experienced by a student, and the student next to them might experience a completely different one as well. So what we haven't done enough is to be able to analyze what the students are experiencing. Now, that's a kind of ironic thing, because so many of the subfields of education research, science education 1, for example, physics education, all those sort of subfields of educational technology, they have an overwhelming tendency to look at students learning. And I think it's related to the knowledge blindness. So don't see knowledge, only see knowing, ways of knowing. That leads to thinking about what students are doing, leads to focusing on learning. And so you have all these studies of how students learn as if teachers do nothing and as if teaching doesn't exist. So this is a kind of counterbalance to that. But one of the things is that one has to watch out for that becoming a kind of mirror opposite, not a counterbalance, but becoming unbalanced in itself, so that we only focus on teaching and what the teacher's expressing, we would only see we would only have just as partial a picture, a partial view of the picture of the whole, as do so many of the dominant approaches and so many of the subfields of education who only focus on learning. So we need to look at learning too. So in the name of the book, Knowledge and Knowers, I would say LCT has focused overwhelmingly on knowledge and very, very little as yet on knowers in terms of things like students. And I think a similar thing, I think this is a similar thing that happened in SFL as well, with a lot of trying to bring the users back into seeing how language is being used. And it's just something we have to be careful about, because I think We can't just say, this is what the teacher did, this is what was experienced. Absolutely no, not at all. This is what the teacher did doesn't mean it's experienced. We have to find ways of getting funding for that sort of thing. Now, the other thing is, one thing.
Sorry, very aware of time, but Jim
sure.
wants to come back into the conversation. Do you want to?
Anytime, Jim. Anytime, anyone. Just jump in.
Jim, do you want to come back in?
Anytime, anybody, just jump in.
I might have been, I'm sorry about that. I might have been mistaken. I thought I had his hand up there. So you go on, sorry.
I can't remember what I was saying.
Yeah. No, that's true. Well,
yes. I would say, no, I know what I was saying is that one of the other things is that people always forget that there is a serendipity or a particular set of historical circumstances to the focus of the content of any particular set of studies. So, for example, I've spent the last, I suppose, about 10 years now looking at classrooms in secondary schooling because we got grants to do so. You know, the grants I put in for studying students and their experiences didn't get funded for various reasons. So it's a case of, as a field, we have to do this, you know, and I would be really welcoming of more studies of what students are experiencing.
I think it's funny, you know, they're having the teachers, you know, senior science teachers that we've been working with coming out after the lesson and say, you know, great, we got through the content, you know, meaning that they got back to the sovereign field and did it. And, you know, me being in the classroom thinking, and who came with you, you know, from the learner's perspective, I think you're quite right. We often are looking at that kind of bigger planned, you know, thing and not thinking about what the journey was from that point of view. Yes. Anybody else would like to ask a question or
Dominic.
comment?
Yeah, sorry, I asked a question in the chat, but somebody just said, ask it and put it on the video. So I'm going to ask it on the video.
Please do, people, by the way. Otherwise, I'm just like sitting here with me. I don't want to sit with me.
So what
we're my friends here.
If I've understood correctly, maybe I haven't, is that the knowledge creation is better through this autonomy tour, right? That if we start somewhere in the sovereign target, we're moving down into the exotic, introjected, and then back. There's probably more knowledge creation going on. Now, I just wonder, you know, having been a science teacher and now an English teacher, and having a background in all of that kind of like learning as if teacher didn't exist kind of world, it can be a bit crazy sometimes. I'm just wondering if the role of the kind of function of the autonomy tour helping learning is it softens the barriers in some way to allow students to link it with concepts themselves. Do you see what I mean? It's like,
yeah.
I'm just wondering if if I'm just going off in the wrong.
Well, there's a couple of things. Firstly, I would say, no, I didn't say there's more creation of knowledge, and I didn't say the words creation of knowledge at all. So there might be more integrating and building of knowledge out of different kinds of sources. And that may sound like a pedantic point, but I worry about the word creation because, anyway, it doesn't matter. But I know what you mean.
Building of knowledge. I'm sorry.
No, that's right. It's just like, I'm always a bit nervous when people start saying students create knowledge. I think, really? Do they? Really? What's that word mean? Knowledge then? But anyway, let's go on.
They can make some funky things up sometimes.
It's a really interesting idea. The idea that, I mean, I think at a big level, so because it's done very fractally, right? So at a big level, I would say getting outside your target, getting outside your sovereign code is really important for a whole range of reasons. So, I mean, some of them are to do with students or newcomers or where they're coming from, where they bring ideas already that are probably not inside your target. So everyday experiences, whatever it might be, previous understandings, previous learning, previous knowledge, and you want to connect with that. And you've got to have to get out of your target to get often to connect with that. It can be more engaging and so on. And yes, it might also enable things that are otherwise separated to be brought together. I wouldn't say soften things, because actually sometimes it can be really valuable to harden a boundary. So it can be really valuable to say, okay, now we're doing linguistics. We're not doing sociology anymore, we're doing linguistics. Now let's talk about linguistics and let's talk about what field means here. And once everybody's up to speed on that, now we're going to interject it and bring it back into this LCT analysis. So sometimes being outside for a while and being strongly bounded is a good thing. The science teacher who's really good did it. She does it whereby she keeps things separate in order to clarify what those things are. And sometimes good teachers do that. They'll say, does everybody understand this thing from somewhere else? You know, like if I was going to use some SFL in a talk, I'd say, okay, I want everybody to understand what this means, and to make sure that you think I understand it. Field means da 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 da. Okay, now interjecting that into our analysis, turning that to the purpose here. So sometimes it can be hardening that's good, but again, it's a sort of hardening, softening perhaps that enables things to be brought together and connected. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I don't believe in the blender model of shoving things together and just spinning it, you know, like just thinking it will all work out somehow. Because I think even together, it can be separated, you know, like I'm not a very good cook. And I can tell you, just putting things together and heating them or whatever doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to make something tasty. And it can easily separate.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we will certainly take, you know, notes of other questions, and I'm really glad you got to put that one forward, Dominic. That's fantastic. But I think we're out of time, and would you like to just kind of close it off with any last thought there, Karl?
Well, I'll just say to Linda Tan, no, I don't know if anybody who's studied beginning versus more experienced teachers, and it would be an excellent topic. There are definitely, to Jennifer, there are definitely good and bad uses of going into the exotic, and you know, I should say that not all tours, I said it before, have the same pathway. They could be going all the way around, or they could be just go back and forward, a return trip into another code. Yes, and I think it'd be very, very interesting to consider also to compare what a teacher wants to do in terms of this sort of thing as opposed to what actually happens as well. That would be very, very interesting.
Well,
just going through the chat here.
There are so many lines of research opened up and so many conversations opened up, and I feel really, really excited because I can feel, you know, I need to sort of build this conversation immediately in my own work. So thank you.
Well, I'm gonna just close off what I'm gonna say then by saying this, which is, I thought, this is a personal failure, but I thought, failing of mine, is I thought when we redeveloped, renovated entirely the autonomy codes, that was myself and Sarah Howard, renovated entirely the autonomy codes concepts from their original conceptualization. I thought, oh, I'll write this paper or the occasional paper taking autonomy tours, and then I'll write up temporality, and that'll be it. That's it for me. I'm done. And then I discovered that just doing the autonomy thing opened up so many possibilities for me to see so many fantastic, interesting things that I realized actually I've got a good few years of autonomy ahead of me. And
that's fantastic.
I mean, you know, it's the same experience. I have knowledge is not just reducible to its creator or author or whatever. I experience it in the same way, you know, that you kind of like, you get to learn it, to meet it as a thing outside yourself. And for me, using autonomy to look at things like maths and science, to look at things like video animations and teaching, to look at humor, whether humor works, so an analysis of a comedy sketch that works really, really well. Those sorts of things, you just suddenly realize, wow, this has got so many things to answer and address. And I offer this to SFL people with no sense that this is finished or complete or can answer any of your questions yet. I mean, this is just the starting point, and so much of autonomy is yet to be written. Let's write it together.
Exactly. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
thank you for being here.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Karl. Thanks, Sally.
Thanks, Sue. Thanks, Dominic. Thanks, Vin, for inviting me, and Sally for introducing me and sharing, and Daniel and Richard and everyone else who's here.
So, Vin, do you come in this day?
Thank you, everybody from Nigeria, and bye-bye.
Nigeria. Oh my gosh, that's great.
I'll leave you to say goodbye to them, Karl. That's great.
Right, well, I'm going to go now. So thank you, everybody, for being here.
That's right. They're not going to go without you going.
Thanks so much again, Karl. Thanks, Sally. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. See you again soon. Thanks so much again, Karl. Thanks, Sally. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. See you again soon.